real-life horror stories that will haunt your every move. Be advised, it's so terrifying that 90% of people couldn't last more than 30 minutes before shutting it off. Consider this your only warning.
In June of 2013, my husband Michael and I made plans to spend a quiet week at our old family farmhouse in rural Maine. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, a chance for all of us to recharge away from the city. Unfortunately, Michael serves in the U.S. Army, and he couldn't get leave at the last minute. Rather than cancel our plans, I decided to go along with our two kids, Emily, who was 10, and Jacob, who was 8. The farmhouse sits a few miles outside of Ellsworth, surrounded by acres of untamed fields. It's rustic, built in the late 1940s by my grandfather. I've always found comfort in the creaky porch and the smell of old wood, though the place can feel very isolated at times. Cell reception is spotty, and there's no modern security system, just simple locks on the doors and windows. We arrived on a sunny afternoon. The kids immediately dashed around, excited to see the orchard and the small flower garden out back. Everything seemed perfectly normal that first day. I unpacked groceries, checked the plumbing, and felt a soft sense of relief. Even though Michael wasn't there, I was happy to share this corner of my childhood with Emily and Jacob. The next morning, I stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee. I noticed something odd. The old deck chair near the railing wasn't where it had been. It looked like it had been pulled halfway across the porch. My first thought was that the kids had moved it. But when I asked them, they both insisted they hadn't touched it. Later that day, I also realized a small garden statue, a weathered gnome, had shifted several inches from its usual spot. Little details, but enough to make me uneasy. Since we don't have any cameras or alarms, there wasn't much I could do. I double-checked the locks and decided to keep an eye on my surroundings. I tried not to let on that I was rattled, but my mind kept circling back to why someone would move a deck chair or a garden statue. It seemed so pointless. That afternoon, Emily and Jacob played tag near the bushes that lined the backyard fence. I was inside washing dishes when I heard Jacob yell. I rushed out, expecting a scraped knee or a bee sting. Instead, both kids looked pale. Jacob whispered that he saw a man wearing some kind of white mask peering at them through the brush. Emily nodded and said the man crouched down when he realized they'd spotted him. I ran to the fence, but no one was there. I tried to stay calm. There are a few neighbors scattered along the nearby road. Maybe one of them was on our property for some odd reason. I told the kids we'd stay inside for the rest of the day, just to be safe. Night came without incident. We locked the doors and slept in the living room, the three of us huddled together on the pull-out sofa. Every small creak in the house had my nerves on edge, but aside from my own restless thoughts, nothing else happened. The following morning, I noticed footprints in the soft dirt near the side of the farmhouse. It looked like someone walked around the entire perimeter, circling the building. My heart pounded with the realization that this wasn't just an overactive imagination. Someone had clearly been exploring the property overnight. I spent the rest of the day feeling jumpy, suspecting every rustle in the grass. That evening, after tucking Emily and Jacob into bed, I looked out the window facing the garden. My breath caught in my throat. A tall figure stood near the gnome statue, partially hidden by the shrubs. The person wasn't moving, just standing there as if studying the house. I froze, uncertain of my next move. Then he turned his head in my direction. Even from a distance, I felt his stare. It didn't last long. As soon as he spotted me, he took off, darting across the yard and disappearing into the same line of bushes where the kids had seen him earlier. The first thing the next morning, I called the local police department. An officer named Benson arrived within the hour. He searched the property and checked for footprints or signs of forced entry, but found nothing definitive. It was both frustrating and a little embarrassing to explain, because aside from some moved objects and footprints, we didn't have concrete evidence that could identify who was behind it. The rest of our stay passed uneventfully. Whoever that masked man was, he never showed up again. Maybe our call to the police had scared him off. Emily and Jacob remained a bit on edge. but as the days wore on, we tried to shift focus to the positive aspects of our getaway. Still, I couldn't fully relax. Each night, I'd sit by the window, scanning the yard for any movement. We finished our vacation and drove back, relieved to return to busier roads and nearby neighbors. I told Michael everything, but without any proof, there was little else to do besides move on. Sometimes I still wonder who that man was, or what he wanted, creeping around our farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. Part of me worries he's done the same thing to other people's homes. Maybe just watching, maybe planning something worse. I was 19 at the time, working the late shift at a small gas station on the outskirts of Redfield, about 30 minutes from where I lived. My schedule usually ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., so I'd spend most nights sipping cold coffee, trying not to fall asleep at the register, and hoping I wouldn't have to deal with anything too crazy. It was a pretty quiet area. When I first started, I told myself it was going to be an easy gig. Just ring up drinks and snacks, maybe help someone pump their gas if they were confused. Easy money, right? I remember the first time I saw the old man. It was a Tuesday night in early November. Typical shift, nothing out of the ordinary. He walked in around 2 a.m., wearing a pressed flannel shirt, clean jeans, and carrying a small newspaper under his arm. His voice cracked gently as he mumbled, "Good evening." Something about him was disarming. I guess friendly grandpa vibes are how I'd describe it. He bought a black coffee, thanked me with a warm smile, and headed out. No big deal. But he started coming back, night after night, usually around the same time. It got to the point where I'd have his coffee ready before he even asked. If I'm being honest, I looked forward to seeing him. Working that shift was lonely, and I craved human interaction. Any kind of conversation to pass the hours. He introduced himself as Martin. He never mentioned a last name, and I didn't ask. It felt nice to have a bit of company. Over the next week, Martin and I chatted more each time. We kept it light. We talked about local news, the weather, and the upcoming holidays. Once in a while, he'd ask me about the station itself, how many people worked there, whether we had cameras inside, if we kept a lot of money in the register at night. At first, I didn't think much of it. People get curious, especially older folks, and I'd been warned that sometimes lonely retirees hang out at gas stations or small diners just to talk to someone. Still, I found it odd how he kept steering the conversation back to store procedures. On November 10th, around 3 a.m., he showed up with his usual grin, sipping coffee while leaning against the counter. He asked if I felt safe working alone. I shrugged it off and said I do. We have a decent security system, and we never keep more than a couple hundred in the till at a time. I even told him about our manager, Don, who would drop by unexpectedly once in a while. Martin listened carefully. He tilted his head, gave a thoughtful nod, then changed the subject. A few nights later, a couple of local cops came in. I didn't recognize them, but they seemed on edge. One of them asked me if I'd noticed any suspicious activity around the area. I froze for a second, remembering Martin's oddly specific questions. But I told the officers I hadn't seen anything suspicious, just a few regular customers and the same old night owls. They left in a hurry, without buying anything. I was left with a weird feeling in my gut, but I convinced myself I was just overreacting. Martin kept visiting, and I kept talking. By mid-November, I'd let slip a lot of details. How the security cameras sometimes glitched, how I was the only one with keys to the supply room at night, and even how I usually had a routine for counting the drawer. I know it sounds stupid now, but back then I was just excited to have someone to chat with. He never seemed threatening or pushy. He'd just nod and ask casual follow-up questions like he was making conversation. On November 19th, I remember feeling a strange tension in the air. The parking lot was dead quiet, and the overhead lights seemed dimmer than usual. Martin didn't show up at his regular time, which left me a little anxious. I tried to brush it off, but this eerie stillness lingered. By 4 a.m., no customers had come in for nearly 2 hours. That was unusual, even for our slow town. I left the counter to restock some sodas. Then I heard it, a loud crash from the back of the store. My heart pounded. In my mind, I half expected Martin to pop out from behind the shelves and spook me. but the door was wide open and some boxes had fallen off the racks. At first, I thought it was just an accident. Then I saw two men in ski masks rushing through the storage area. One of them was carrying a duffel bag. The other held what looked like a pistol. They didn't see me at first, so I ducked behind the aisle, trying not to breathe too loudly. My mind was racing. Where's Martin? Is he here too? Eventually, I heard them sprint out the back door. I waited, heart in my throat, until I couldn't hear footsteps anymore. I scrambled to the front to call the police, but by the time they arrived, whoever was involved was long gone. The entire back storeroom was ransacked. The register was forced open. Cash is gone. A security camera was smashed. The police questioned me for hours. All I could think about was Martin. Did he have something to do with this? As it turned out, the break-in was part of a string of robberies in nearby counties. The following day, the cops pulled me in for further questioning because I knew Martin. They showed me a grainy photo from another gas station's security footage. It was him, wearing the same flannel, but with a very different expression. Focused, steely-eyed. Not the warm smile I remembered. My stomach dropped. They asked me everything. How he looked, what we talked about, what details I'd given him. I felt nauseous. I realized how carefully he'd manipulated me. He'd used my loneliness, my boredom, and my kindness to extract every detail he needed to make the robbery quick and clean. I hated myself for not seeing it. A week passed. I hadn't slept well since the robbery. One afternoon, my manager called to say that Martin had been arrested and was in custody. It turned out his real name wasn't Martin at all. The police found him barricaded in his basement. He'd been hiding down there after the robbery, probably waiting for the heat to die down. There was a lot of stolen merchandise, money, and a stash of weird documentation about local stores, including my gas station. I was relieved, briefly. But then my manager mentioned something unsettling. When the cops searched his basement, they found a list of employees, details about our schedules, and even personal notes. Next to my name, he'd scribbled a phone number that wasn't mine. We still don't know whose number it was. That's the part I can't let go of. Before we dive into the next story, if you're visiting our channel for the first time, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell icon to stay updated with our upcoming scary stories. Your support means the world to us, so please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I was a junior at Greenfield College in upstate New York back in October of 2019. My days usually followed a predictable routine. I would wake up around 7 in the morning, attend my first lecture at 8, grab lunch with friends around noon, and then head to study sessions or the library in the evenings. My dorm was on the second floor of Maple Hall, the all-girls residence building. It was a comfortable enough place, a narrow hallway, identical wooden doors, and the usual chatter from neighbors. On Monday afternoon, my friend Kristen mentioned that she had noticed a tall man in a black hoodie near the student center. According to her, he seemed to linger where I was, watching from a distance. I laughed it off at first, because I had never noticed anyone unusual. Kristen shrugged, saying maybe it was just someone who had a class nearby. It didn't feel like a big deal, until others quietly hinted that they too had seen someone dressed exactly the same way, always near me, never approaching. As the week went on, I found myself becoming hyper-aware of my surroundings. Every time I walked across campus, I would glance around, expecting to see that hoodie. There were moments when I thought I caught a glimpse of someone in the corner of my eye, but whenever I tried to focus, they melted into the crowd, or simply turned out to be someone different. When I told my roommate Mary, she insisted I was letting my imagination run wild. I almost believed her, because I had yet to see any man in a hoodie deliberately following me. That Thursday, I had an evening lab and left the building around 9. The path to Maple Hall was dimly lit. As I made my way back, I saw someone in a hoodie walking toward me from the far side of the quad. My heart pounded, but as he passed, he didn't even glance in my direction. I felt a mix of relief and frustration. Could this be the same person everyone kept mentioning? It was nothing more than a quick walk by, leaving me no closer to an answer. On Friday night, Mary and I decided to spend extra time in the campus library. Midterm papers were looming, and the quiet space helped me concentrate. Around 10:30, Mary said she was tired and wanted to head back to the dorm. I insisted on staying a few more minutes to find an important reference book. She left, and I was nearly alone on the second floor, scanning the shelves under the fluorescent lights. I was leaning forward, struggling to reach a worn copy of some old literary commentary, when a low voice behind me said, "Is this the book you're looking for?" Startled, I turned around. It was the same hoodie, black, with the hood pulled halfway over his face. He handed me the exact volume I'd been searching for. I thanked him quietly, not sure what else to say, and quickly slipped out of the aisle. By the time I was at the library exit, I began to wonder if I should have asked him why he'd been around so often, or even for his name. Yet a strange unease set in, and I just wanted to be back in my room. Outside, the campus felt emptier than usual. Street lamps cast faint circles of light on the walkway. Halfway to Maple Hall, I heard footsteps behind me. They stopped when I stopped. When I turned, I saw no one, but I thought I caught a flash of movement near a large oak tree. My pulse quickened, and I broke into a brisk walk. The footsteps resumed a bit faster. I whirled around, and this time he was there. The same figure in that dark hoodie, standing still. He was gripping something behind his back, as though hiding it. Without thinking, I sprinted toward my dorm, my ears thudding with the sound of my footsteps. I could hear his feet slapping the concrete behind me. The path seemed endless, but finally, Maple Hall came into view. I burst through the main door, nearly knocking it off its hinges, and fled upstairs to my room. Once inside, I locked the door and stood there, trying to calm my breathing. I thought I heard faint footsteps in the hallway, but they never stopped at my door, and eventually, the night went silent. Early the next morning, I reported the incident to campus security. An officer named Mr. Thompson took down my statement in his small, cluttered office near the administration building. He seemed to take it seriously, asking about the man's description and behavior. For the rest of that day, I avoided being alone, sticking close to Kristen and Mary. Every random passerby in a hoodie made me flinch. Over the following weeks, there were no more sightings of the strange man. No one else reported a student or visitor matching his description. The campus felt oddly the same, and yet for me, it was changed forever. Security never identified him, nor did he make another appearance. It's been years since then, but the memory still lingers. No one could ever tell me if he was a harmless loner who happened to be around too often, or something far worse. I'm an artist, and for a long time, my main source of income was traveling to comic, anime, and video game conventions all over the US and Canada, sometimes even other countries. You'd be surprised how profitable it can be if you play your cards right. It's also a lot more work than people realize. Countless hours at a table, chatting with curious folks, and making sure you have fresh inventory at each stop. Back in those days, I used to do custom drawings for people right at the conventions. Then, as my art improved and I got busier, I decided to stop. Honestly, it just didn't fit into my schedule anymore, and I was moving on to bigger projects. Still, as I was winding down my commission work, a man approached me at a con and asked if I could draw something furry-related for him. At first, I was reluctant. I'd never done furry artwork, but I needed the income, and he was offering a good amount of cash. It felt awkward, but money is money, so I gave it a shot. One night, after I finished that piece, I realized word had spread in the community about my skills. I started getting more and more requests from people who liked my style and wanted similar drawings. Anthropomorphic characters, bright and playful designs, that sort of thing. It wasn't long before I got the idea to create a separate account on a furry-focused art site, all under a new nickname. It kept my personal name out of the picture, and I figured it wouldn't interfere with my regular Comic-Con work. Over time, I met many people online. Most were nice, some were eccentric, and a few had pretty unique requests. Eventually, I began chatting with another furry artist. She and I bonded over jokes about our experiences, and we developed an easygoing friendship. She claimed she wasn't really into the scene but got drawn to it for the art and the supportive community. I felt the same in a way. I appreciated the audience, but never truly embraced the lifestyle. Months later, she suggested I come to a furry convention, or at least come to a hybrid event that combined an anime con I was already attending with a furry con happening at the same venue on the same weekend. It sounded like an interesting idea to scope out a new audience. Plus, she offered to split her dealer's table with me for a day, and we also arranged to share a hotel room. Con artists do this all the time. We're always trying to save on costs, so sharing is pretty normal. I arrived on a Thursday, ready for my anime con, but her furry con had already started. She texted me to drop by her table, which was in the dealer's den. Since I had nothing else to do that evening, I thought it couldn't hurt. I picked up a temporary badge she'd arranged for me and headed in. The first thing I noticed was the wide array of colorful fursuits, dancing lights, and people milling about with an energy that felt different from the anime cons I knew. Standing at her table was someone in a big, elaborate fursuit, a bright pink, cartoon-like wolf with large eyes. I assumed it was my friend, though I'd never seen her suit up before. I tried introducing myself, but she didn't speak. Instead, she nodded, squeaked a little squeaker hidden somewhere in her paw, and used gestures to communicate. She preferred staying in character and not talking. It threw me off because in our online chats, she was sarcastic and talkative. But I shrugged it off, figuring maybe this was how she handled conventions. We spent a few hours at her table, and I did my best to interact with passersby, selling some small prints. The night wore on, and around 7 p.m., we packed up. She stayed in full costume the entire time, pantomiming and squeaking, not uttering a single word. We got to our shared hotel room, and I flopped onto my bed. That's when things got uncomfortable. She stepped toward me, and without warning, reached out and tickled my exposed side. I instinctively jolted away, my heart pounding from the surprise. Her character movements didn't change. She continued with these silent, cutesy gestures, but it made me uneasy. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but her behavior felt odd. I tried to laugh it off and asked if she was going to take off the suit. She made a motion like I was going to shower, grabbed some things, and vanished into the bathroom. That's when I decided I needed some fresh air. The idea of waiting around alone for someone I couldn't even see or talk to made me uneasy. I noticed she'd left her wallet on the table. I remembered seeing her slip a hotel key into it, so I quickly opened it, figuring I could grab the key and step out for a bit. I planned to come back later with a friend, but as soon as I opened the wallet, I spotted an ID in the clear slot. It showed someone different than what I'd pictured. A middle-aged man with a scruffy beard, thinning hair, and a grim expression. This was not the same young woman I'd befriended online. My stomach lurched. All I could think about was how I just spent hours alone at a table with this person, someone I knew nothing about in real life. Who were they? What did they want? My brain went into survival mode. I snatched the hotel key, hurled the wallet onto the table, and sprinted out the door. I flew down the stairwell, heart pounding with each step until I reached the lobby. Once there, I called a friend of mine, a big, tough guy also in town for the anime con. He agreed to help me retrieve my belongings. When he got back, he said the room was empty. No sign of the fursuit, no luggage, nothing. It was like that person had vanished. Shaken, I crashed into my friend's hotel room for the remainder of the convention. I avoided the dealer's den and blocked every online connection I had with that friend. The whole experience rattled me enough to shut down my furry alias entirely. Whatever business I was doing, there wasn't worth the risk of running into someone who was not who they claimed to be. I lost my wife back in January 2016. Her name was Allison, and she died on a 2-lane highway just outside Redwood Falls, Minnesota. The police told me a long-haul truck driver had fallen asleep behind the wheel, drifted over the line, and slammed into her car. She stood no chance. He's serving time now, but that fact never brought me any peace. For weeks, I barely left our house on Oak Street. I couldn't handle the reminders of her absence. The half-empty closet, her favorite coffee mug by the sink, the tiny notes she'd leave in my lunch. Night times were a special kind of torment. I'd sit in my recliner in front of the TV, but I rarely watched anything. I mostly stared at the blank screen, thinking about how quickly life can unravel. One Saturday night in mid-February, the ache of missing Allison felt impossible to ignore. Around 10:30 p.m., I grabbed my jacket and keys, deciding to visit her grave. It wasn't the smartest decision. I was tired, the roads were quiet, and a cemetery at nearly 11 p.m. isn't exactly comforting, but I couldn't shake the urge. I needed to feel close to her, even in a place so dark. I drove west on County Road 14, the one that winds through farmland and old industrial lots. It's a bit longer than taking the highway, but less traffic. At that hour, though, it felt completely abandoned. My headlights illuminated nothing but endless pavement and the occasional silhouette of a barn or silo in the distance. Halfway along the route, I spotted a car parked at an awkward angle on the shoulder. Its hazard lights were off, and in the dim glow, I could make out a woman standing beside it. As I slowed down, my heart skipped because she looked so much like Allison. Same height, same brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail. It felt surreal, and maybe that's why I didn't think twice about pulling over. I rolled down my window, and she stepped close, saying something about her car not starting. She spoke softly, her voice trembling just enough to stir my sympathy. I offered to have a look, mentioning I worked as a mechanic at a local shop called Don's Auto Service. She seemed relieved and led me to the front of the car. Popping the hood, I did a quick inspection. Battery cables, belts, and hoses. Nothing seemed obviously wrong. The entire time, my mind was racing. Why did she look so much like Allison? It made no sense, but grief can do strange things to perception. I tried to focus, but a nagging sense of unease settled in my gut. Suddenly, I heard a shuffle behind me. Before I could turn, something struck me on the back of the head. The world tilted sideways, and my knees buckled. I fell hard onto the pavement. Through blurred vision, I glimpsed two men emerging from the darkness. One clutched a steel rod. The woman stood there, eyes colder than I ever thought possible, as if she'd lured me into a trap. Then everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was in a hospital bed. The fluorescent lights were harsh, and there was a dull ache at the back of my skull. A doctor named Morgan explained he'd been driving to Redwood Falls Hospital for his night shift and saw me lying by the side of the road. He found no other car, no woman, no one else around. Just me, unconscious and bleeding. I asked about my own car. He said he never saw any vehicle on the shoulder, only my body sprawled on the pavement. Panic set in. I called the police and filed a report about the attack and my missing car. Days turned into weeks, and updates never came. Every phone call ended the same way. "We're looking into it, sir." No security footage, no eyewitnesses, and no trace of the vehicle's license plate in the region. Friends and family tried to reassure me that maybe it was a random carjacking. Others hinted I'd been imagining some details, that my grief might have distorted what I witnessed. I know what I saw, though I remember clearly how that woman's hair and face resembled Allison's. I remember her voice and how she led me into that vulnerable moment. I still visit Allison's grave, but not at night. Sometimes I'll leave flowers and think about what happened on that road. I wonder who those men were, whether the woman was working with them from the start, and why they left me for dead. Part of me can't shake the suspicion they planned something far worse than just stealing a car. You know how it is when life gets so busy you stop seeing the person you love? That was me and Ben in 2018. We both work pretty demanding jobs. I'm a nurse and he's in software development. So for months, we hadn't taken any real time off. Our schedules barely lined up, and when they did, we were too exhausted to do anything fun. Tempers started flaring, and little arguments kept popping up over nothing. Finally, we agreed we needed a break. We decided to rent an Airbnb for a whole week in 2018, just the two of us, hoping we could relax and reconnect. We found a cozy-looking house in a small town outside of Asheville, North Carolina. The listing mentioned a quiet location, a big backyard, and proximity to hiking trails, exactly what we wanted. The host seemed friendly enough in his online messages. He did mention that sometimes there was a thumping noise coming from the basement pipes, but assured us it was nothing to worry about. It felt like a small quirk, so we didn't think much of it. The first day, we arrived in the late afternoon. The house looked just like the photos. Charming front porch, a warm interior, and lots of natural light. The host left a note on the kitchen counter with some instructions about trash pickup, the Wi-Fi password, and a gentle reminder not to mind the basement if we heard any odd noises. I'll admit that part made me a little uneasy. but Ben brushed it off, saying every older home has its quirks. For the first 3 nights, nothing happened. We'd hear some faint thumping right around bedtime, but it would stop after a while, so we ignored it. We didn't bother going down to the basement at all because we didn't need to. There was no laundry to do, and the host hadn't given us any reason to. Instead, we spent our days hiking local trails and our evenings cooking dinner and watching TV together. It was nice to finally have time to just sit and talk without rushing off somewhere. Then came the 4th night. We were getting ready for bed when the thumping returned, only this time it was louder and more rhythmic than before. Ben paused whatever show we were watching and gave me a questioning look. "That's not just pipes," he said. I felt a chill in my gut, but nodded in agreement. We made our way down to the basement door and flicked on the light. The wooden stairs creaked under our feet as we descended. It was colder down there and honestly, a bit creepy. Boxes and old furniture were stacked against the walls, and near the back of the basement, there was a heavy-looking metal door with a rusted padlock on it. The thumping sound was definitely coming from behind that door. We both just stood there, not sure what to do. We tried calling the host, but it went straight to voicemail. We left a somewhat panicked message and then went back upstairs. Neither of us slept well that night, lying awake and imagining all sorts of scenarios. By morning, we still hadn't heard from the host, so once he finally answered, we asked him about the locked metal door. He sounded almost irritated, telling us it was just an old storage room that hadn't been touched in years and that we should leave it alone. Ben pressed a bit, and the host dismissed our concerns, repeating that it was just junk in there. That night, the thumping returned around 10 p.m. This time, I swear it sounded almost like someone knocking rather than pipes. Ben and I looked at each other, and without even speaking, we both headed straight to the basement. The thumping was louder now, like whoever or whatever was behind that door was getting more desperate. We knocked on the metal door, feeling kind of foolish, but also too freaked out not to. Then we heard the faintest voice. It was definitely human, and it sounded weak, like they were exhausted or hurt. In that instant, everything changed from a weird inconvenience to a genuine emergency. We ran back upstairs to grab a heavy tire iron Ben kept in the car. When we got back to the basement, the thumping had stopped, but we could still hear this strained breathing coming through the metal door. Ben told me to stand back while he tried to pry the lock open. It wouldn't budge, so I grabbed a hammer from a nearby shelf, and we started hitting at the lock until it finally snapped. As soon as we got the door open, we were hit with the smell of stale air and saw a middle-aged man, probably in his early 40s, huddled on the floor. He looked dehydrated and terrified. We helped him up, and he could barely get the words out, but he explained that he was the host's relative. Something had gone horribly wrong in their relationship. He didn't go into much detail, but it sounded like a nasty family feud. He claimed the host had basically kidnapped him, locking him in the basement for who knows how long. We wasted no time calling the police. A squad car arrived within 15 minutes. The officers took our statements and then helped the man out of the basement and into an ambulance. Shortly after, more police showed up, and they told us they'd track down the host immediately. It was obvious we couldn't stay there anymore. Ben and I packed up our belongings as fast as we could. We felt sick knowing we'd spent days in that house while someone was trapped down there. The police assured us that we'd done the right thing, but we still felt a knot of guilt in our stomachs. We ended up driving to a motel a few towns over that night, barely speaking the whole way, just trying to process everything. We never got the full story of what happened between the host and that man, but we knew enough. The next day, we got a call from the police saying they had arrested the Airbnb host and that the man had been released to his own family. We thanked them and let them know we'd be heading home. That was the end of our little vacation. This happened back in 2005 when I was just 10 years old. I lived in a small town in Iowa where kids would roam the streets without much worry. My house wasn't too far from the local playground, maybe 4 or 5 blocks. Normally, my mom or dad picked me up, but that evening, they both got held up at work. I decided to head home on my own. It was a late summer afternoon. The sun was still out, but the shadows stretched longer than usual. I remember feeling a small pinch of nerves, but I told myself everything would be fine. I walked along the sidewalk, backpack slung over one shoulder, and noticed how quiet the neighborhood was. I didn't see anyone else on the street, not even another kid on a bike. Then I heard something. At first, it was too soft to identify, just a faint crunch of gravel. I glanced over my shoulder and caught a glimpse of a tall figure. He wore dark pants and maybe a jacket. My memory's fuzzy on the details, but I vividly recall how he seemed to slow down the moment I looked his way. I couldn't see his face clearly, which unnerved me. I turned around and walked faster, trying to act casual. My heart started to pound. I picked up the pace, taking a different route than usual. I hoped maybe he'd keep going, or that I'd spot a neighbor outside who could help. But every time I glanced back, he was still there, hanging back at a distance. Something about his posture felt too deliberate, like he was trying not to get too close, but close enough to keep me in sight. I rounded the corner and spotted an old, rundown house that had been vacant for years. I'd passed it plenty of times before. The windows were boarded up and the porch sagged badly. In the moment, hiding inside seemed like the safest bet. I figured he wouldn't follow me in there, so I slipped through a gap in the fence and crept behind the house. The interior was dark and smelled musty. A narrow hallway led into what used to be a living room, scattered with debris, broken drywall, bits of trash, and an old mattress. My hands trembled as I tried to steady myself against the wall. I was alone in that dim space, hoping the man wouldn't dare enter. That's when I saw it. In a corner, partially hidden by a collapsed section of ceiling, lay what looked like an old man. His clothes were tattered and dirty, and he didn't move. My mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe he was asleep. But when I stepped a bit closer, I realized he wasn't breathing at all. His skin looked pale and sunken like he'd been there for a while. A rush of fear shot through me, so intense my eyes welled up with tears. Without warning, I heard footsteps echo in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, each step crunching on shattered plaster. My breath caught in my throat. I remembered the man who had been following me. Was he inside now, too? I couldn't bring myself to look around the corner. All I wanted to do was get out. So I bolted. I sprinted through the debris, ducked through a shattered window, and stumbled into the backyard. My legs scraped on something, maybe a broken piece of wood, but I barely felt the pain. I ran onto the street, my heart pounding louder than I thought possible. When I looked over my shoulder, I didn't see the man anymore, just the empty yard, the boards, and the fence. I kept running and finally spotted a police car parked on the curb near a small convenience store. An officer was standing outside, chatting with the store owner. I rushed up to them, tears streaming down my face, babbling about a man chasing me and a dead person in that abandoned house. The officer's expression quickly changed from annoyance to concern. He opened the passenger door and told me to get in. Inside the car, I was shaking so hard I could barely speak. The officer tried to calm me, asking simple questions. Where did I live? Was I hurt? Meanwhile, he radioed for backup. Another officer arrived and headed toward the old house. The one driving me told me I'd be taken home to my parents. When we pulled up to my house, my mom was already on the porch, pacing frantically. She must have gotten off work and found me missing. The officer explained to her what I'd said, then gave me a reassuring pat on the shoulder and told me to stay safe. And just like that, he left to join his partner at the old building. I never found out the full story. I overheard my mom calling the police station later, but they were tight-lipped, saying they'd investigated the scene. They wouldn't confirm anything about the man following me or the body. My dad tried to soothe me, saying that sometimes homeless people take shelter in abandoned places. But that hardly explained who the other man was or what he was doing lurking behind me. To this day, I can't walk by a boarded-up house without thinking of that dead old man lying there alone. And I still wonder if the person who followed me had anything to do with him, or if he was just some random stranger. Not knowing has stuck with me all these years, a nagging question that never got answered. I was 13 in the summer of 2022. when my parents decided to treat us to a week-long cruise departing from Miami, Florida. It was supposed to be this incredible adventure, my first time on a ship. The day before we sailed, we stayed at a small hotel near the port. I remember watching enormous cruise liners glide by, feeling a rush of excitement that one of them would be ours the next day. On boarding day, everything was a blur of lines, ID checks, and bright, over-enthusiastic staff members. I couldn't stop staring at the sheer size of the vessel. My dad, Bill, kept joking about how we'd need a map just to find our cabin. My mom, Sarah, was obsessed with the buffets, certain we'd eat ourselves silly by the time we got home. Looking back, I wish I'd stayed glued to their side for the entire trip. Our first couple of days at sea were pretty much what I'd imagined: swimming pools, massive dining rooms, and loud arcades. I spent most of my time exploring on my own, trying to memorize the decks and the shortcuts between them. On the second night, while I was heading back to our cabin, I noticed someone standing behind a row of deck chairs. A guy in a dark hoodie. He was just out of the overhead light's reach, making it hard to see his face. I tried not to think much of it. After all, the ship was filled with thousands of people, many of them wearing hoodies in the chilly sea breeze. Yet, I felt a subtle sense of unease, like I was being watched. By the time I got to our cabin, I felt silly for letting a random stranger spook me. The next day, my parents and I joined an organized shore excursion. When we got off the ship in Nassau, I was excited to see the vibrant markets and try local snacks. While waiting in line for a tour van, I glanced back toward the pier. That same hooded figure stood in the crowd, leaning against a railing. I couldn't see his face, but I had this gut feeling it was the same person from the deck chairs. My mind raced with questions. Why would he be following me? Was I imagining it? Throughout the excursion, I kept glancing around, half expecting to see that hoodie at every corner. We visited the Queen's Staircase, then some historic forts, and ended with a quick lunch. I didn't notice him again, so I tried to shove the worries out of my head. But that evening, after dinner, I told my mom I was heading to the arcade. She and my dad wanted to check out a music show, so I navigated the ship alone. The corridors were emptier than usual. Everyone was probably still eating or at the show. Suddenly, I heard quiet footsteps behind me. When I turned, there he was, just a few paces back, half of his face hidden by the hood. I froze, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then he turned down a side hallway and disappeared. My stomach churned as I practically ran to the arcade. I stayed there, pretending to play games I didn't even like, until I thought I was safe. Once I got back to our cabin, I locked the door and tried to push the memory away. The final night of the cruise came. We were docked at Half Moon Cay, a private island. That evening, I left the cabin to grab a soda before bed, figuring the cafe would be deserted. Walking alone along the open deck felt eerie. The sea was dark and the wind picked up, almost muffling the sound of footsteps behind me. When I turned around, he was standing right there, so close I almost stumbled back. I couldn't see his whole face in the dim light, but I caught sight of what looked like a smirk. He leaned in, and before I could react, he said, "You're lucky I've changed my plan." My heart pounded. I backed away, nearly tripping. By the time I got my footing, he'd stepped into the shadows. I thought about yelling for help, but I couldn't make a sound. I just took off running, not stopping until I reached the busy main deck. I never saw him again. When the ship docked in Miami the next morning, my parents and I left, none the wiser. I was too embarrassed to tell them everything that happened. I only mentioned feeling nervous at night, blaming seasickness or something like that. In June of 2013, my husband Michael and I made plans to spend a quiet week at our old family farmhouse in rural Maine. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, a chance for all of us to recharge away from the city. Unfortunately, Michael serves in the U.S. Army, and he couldn't get leave at the last minute. Rather than cancel our plans, I decided to go along with our two kids, Emily, who was 10, and Jacob, who was 8. The farmhouse sits a few miles outside of Ellsworth, surrounded by acres of untamed fields. It's rustic, built in the late 1940s by my grandfather. I've always found comfort in the creaky porch and the smell of old wood, though the place can feel very isolated at times. Cell reception is spotty, and there's no modern security system, just simple locks on the doors and windows. We arrived on a sunny afternoon. The kids immediately dashed around, excited to see the orchard and the small flower garden out back. Everything seemed perfectly normal that first day. I unpacked groceries, checked the plumbing,